They're really the basis of physiotherapy for children with hemiplegia. There we go. The proprioceptive sense is believed to be made up of information sent to the brain via sensory nerves located in the inner ear, which is the motion and orientation, and in the stretch receptors in the muscles and ligaments supporting the joints. So that is where the information is coming from, and to test how good your proprioception is without vision, you need to close your eyes and put your arm in a position and see if you can copy it with the other arm. So I want you to just try that now, and then you'll get a feeling of what proprioception is. Close your eyes, put your arm in a position, whichever one you choose, and then copy it with your other arm. Okay. That is proprioception in a nutshell, all right? It's your awareness of where that limb is without looking. So I can put my limb anywhere I like, I can bend my leg like that, and I know that I've done that, and I can do it with the other leg, okay, with my eyes closed. That is what proprioception is. If you ask your child to do that with their hemiplegic arm, they will find it very difficult to copy it with their good arm. So it's that way round, all right? You get them to close their eyes, they get them to place their arm in a position, their affected side, and ask them to copy it with their other arm. And most children will have a lot of difficulty with that, okay? Because the proprioception is diminished in their affected side, all right? And you can do it with the legs as well. If the leg is more affected, you can do that with them sat down and position their leg and ask them to do it with your arm. If you get them to close their eyes, that might be the difficult bit. Okay. So if you think about proprioception, without it, a motorist wouldn't be able to drive a car because he wouldn't be able to steer and use the foot pedals and look at the road ahead, because you'd have to be looking at your feet all the time because you wouldn't know what you were doing. All right? You wouldn't be able to touch type like people do, like this, because you'd have to look at your fingers, and you'd be unable to walk without looking at your feet. So I can walk along and I know where my feet are. I might trip over something that's on the floor. Okay, so you're getting the picture. So you can see the importance of proprioception to our everyday movements, and that is linked, like I say, with kinesthesia, which is the feedback that we're getting as we move as well, which will come in a bit later why that's so important as well. Oops, sorry. That's the wrong one. Okay, so a child with hemiplegia has diminished proprioceptive feedback in their affected side. So can you think of some reasons why? Why would that feedback not be as good in that side? This is where we're going to write some things. Sorry? Yeah, loss of sensation. Anything else? Yeah. Nerve damage. Information in the brain. So the awareness, decreased awareness.
I think that's the process.
And difficulties with processing. Yep. So that's giving you a few ideas, some reasons as to why you think the proprioceptive feedback isn't that good. There's one other thing that's very common in children with hemiplegia. What don't they tend to do as much with that arm? Use it, exactly. Kinesthesia. That's where kinesthesia comes in. Because that feedback is related to movement. The more you move it, the more feedback you get. All right? And that links into where physio comes in later on, why we have to do things in a certain way, because of what Anne was saying about spasticity and normal movement. Because if you keep practicing doing something in a spastic pattern, that's what your brain will learn. What physiotherapy does is it teaches you to do it out of the spastic pattern, so that your brain learns something different. Okay? So how does not having proprioceptive feedback affect movement patterns? What tends to happen with children with hemiplegia? What we've mentioned, one, they tend not to use it as much because they're not getting that feedback, they're not getting that awareness of where that limb is in space, so they tend not to move it. What else do they tend to do? Pardon? Yeah, it gets stiff. Yeah. Anything else that you can think of?
They adapt their movements in order to accommodate it.
Yeah. Yeah, so they'll adapt their movements, they'll use whatever they've got, won't they? And if they haven't got much, what do they tend to do? What do you find that children with hemiplegia get very good at doing, at using? Their other hand, exactly. They'll use their other side, they'll just neglect it, won't they? They'll just leave it. They've not got the proprioception coming through. The awareness of that side isn't there as much. The dominance going to the brain is their good side. That's what's going to get there first. The feedback is coming from their affected side, but it gets there slower. So it's like having a race with a hare and a tortoise. The information from the good side is getting through much, much quicker to the brain, and so they think, oh, I'll just do it with this hand. And they get very, very proficient at using one hand. It gets very difficult to then get them to use the other hand, and particularly when they're little, you get a lot of problems with behaviour. When you try to say you've got to use your other hand. Okay. So these are some of the things that we've mentioned. So the child will neglect their affected side, the child will prefer to use their unaffected side in functional activities, and they'll get very proficient at unilaterally using that good arm. I use the terms like that. I know it's not good arm, bad arm, but it just helps with using those terms when we're explaining things. The child will become asymmetrical in their posture and their stance, which is something that we didn't mention. But obviously, the more that they use one side over the other and neglect the other side, the more postural changes you're going to get. So you might find that, you know, they'll get tighter down one side of the body, the hip will start hitching a little bit, the shoulder will get tight. So they'll develop an asymmetry which can affect them later in life, contractures and deformities in their joints and muscles if it isn't managed when they're little. The child can get very upset when you try to encourage them to use their affected side. You have behavioural difficulties, which lots of you have mentioned and Dan's talked about. Very common in the ages between 3 and 7, because they don't understand as well why it's important that they use that unaffected side. And it's not until that affected side, when they get older, they start to understand, all right, a little bit more. So you can sort of work with them a little bit more. But it is an absolute nightmare sometimes trying to get them to do things when they're little. Writing is particularly difficult for children who naturally would have been dominant on their affected side. So it may be that, you know, if you've had a child that would have been left-handed but has had a bleed on the right side of their brain and given them a left hemiplegia, they're not naturally, genetically, were going to be right-handed. They've had to be. And so that can be very difficult. You'll often find that children will have writing that's spidery all over the page and they can't form the letters properly because they're not naturally back-handed. Does that make sense? I'm not sure. Do you know that?
No,
you can scan for it. Yeah, it's and that is obviously a genetic thing. If you and your hubby are both left-handed and your child's got a left hemiplegia, they would have likely have been left-handed. So that's all right. That makes sense. Okay, so as children get older, they become more aware of their difficulties and more conscious of what other people think. And they'll often find strategies to cope with their disability. So you'll see sort of, you know, I've got a couple of lads who put their hand in their school trousers and they walk to school so it doesn't come up as they're walking. You know, so that's just a simple example, but there are, you know, there are lots of things that children, especially when they hit teenage years, will learn to do to adapt. And you actually, they're very good at it. And they find strategies to cope.
Sorry, Helen, can I just ask for the Pycroft family? Thank you.
And then, obviously, we were talking about earlier that there's a couple here who do tricycles, adapt the tricycles. Remember that simple equipment and adaptations can often make the limitations of the so-called disability much less. So it's not that your children can't ride a bike, but they can if you just adapt the bike. It's not that they can't drive a car, they can if you adapt the car. And so that's the way, you know, to look at it, rather than trying to adapt the child to the environment, adapt the environment to the child. That's always something to bear in mind as well when you're looking at equipment. So what can physiotherapy do to help your child? Firstly, it must be clarified, like we said, that the expert in the upper limb is OT. We haven't got an OT here today, obviously, but we would work very closely with them to achieve functional goals as physios, and often do joint sessions. And the other important professional in the triangle of therapists is the orthotist, because they provide the footwear, the splints, both hand and foot, depending on what we require to assist with our therapy. So there's like 3 in the triangle really, and obviously we've got the consultants and, you know, all the other people around in education and everything like that. Ooh, I've done it again, I keep doing that, don't I? Okay, so the role of the physiotherapist is to develop the child's proprioceptive feedback to the brain, to increase the child's awareness of their affected side, and hopefully develop their movement patterns through doing that. This process occurs much more readily early in the child's development due to the rapid brain growth and restructuring, the neuroplasticity, which Anne was talking about, which goes on in the first few years of life. It's most active up to the age of about 2, and then you're going from 2 till 6, there's still lots going on. By 8, the process is starting to slow down a little bit, and by 12, you're looking at what the child is able to function is probably how they are going to be functioning in their everyday life. But what we haven't considered there is puberty, because at 14 or 15, they're going to shoot up. And so the actual disability is not going to change particularly in what they're able to do, but the limitations might change if they're not doing their stretches and they're not working through as they grow. So the therapist will use weight bearing as the key tool for the affected upper and lower limb as a method of increasing proprioceptive input to the brain. This is imperative that it's done in the correct way. So due to the abnormal patterns of movement, which are often apparent in children with hemiplegia, where you get the arm and the leg coming up and the leg turning, it's really important that we don't do weight bearing in those patterns, that we get them out of those patterns and do the weight bearing and get the feedback going into the brain from the joints and muscles which feed into the proprioceptive system. That's what we need to do, it's what we need to do out of those spastic patterns. So for example, if a child is not transferring their weight over their affected hip correctly to step with their unaffected leg, so say this is my hemi side and I'm walking like this, then that's what my brain will learn if I leave them to do that. So the incorrect weight bearing will reinforce the abnormal patterns of the brain and not the normal pattern, okay? And not how you or I would walk, which is where we transfer our weight. I'm exaggerating now, I'm not going on the catwalk. And we transfer our weight, and we transfer our weight, okay? So that I, when I transfer my weight, can stand on that leg and balance for a while. Okay, apart from the fact I'm a bit nervous and my knee's shaking. But other than that, so a child with hemiplegia can't balance like that, okay, and that's your test, all right? It's got to be done in the correct way. So the therapist will teach you with handling how to do it correctly, and that might be handling, it might be equipment, it might be orthotics, it might be anything that helps to get that pattern as good as possible. So if the child is sort of going like this with their foot, then the therapist will probably use an orthotic to make the foot be placed in a good position so the child doesn't have to think about that. All they have to think about is their hip movement, the foot sorted, all right, and they can work on that later. So we would make it as simple as possible for the child so they're not having too many things to have to think about. So it's really important that weight bearing is done both for the upper limb and the lower limb out of the spastic pattern. We've got a lot of weight bearing out of spastic pattern with the upper limb as well, to get feedback, to get awareness, to build up that awareness at that side. Okay, so proprioceptive input feeds into the deep postural muscles. We have 2 sort of sets of muscles. Postural, which hold us up against gravity, and movement muscles, which are the ones that we do all our activities with. So while I'm stood here moving my arm, my postural muscles in my trunk are keeping me stable so I don't fall over when I move this lever all over the place. All right, so we have two different sets of groups of muscles. So the proprioceptive input feeds into the deep postural muscles, and that helps to dampen the effects of this spasticity in the movement muscles. Okay? And that's quite complicated, and I'm not going to explain why, but that's what happens. All right. So we can dampen down the effects of the spasticity by feeding into those postural muscles by doing proprioceptive work, weight bearing and movement. Okay? Postural management comes into here as well, because it's really important that the children are given the opportunity to be in a symmetrical position for lying, sitting, standing, to limit contractures in later life. So some of you might have postural systems in the home, you know, sleep systems, standing frames, walking aids, whatever. Those sorts of things are there to maintain symmetry, to keep symmetry, all right, because that's really important. The main one I think you probably see when the kids are a little bit older is in school. If your children are in school, you'll get little chairs so that they're sat nice and symmetrically so they can use their upper limbs. They're not having to think about balancing and using their arm, sat on a chair with no support. Okay? So that's the sort of simplest way of thinking about it. Passive stretches, as Anne mentioned, are used to monitor joint ranges of movement. So you'll all probably have been shown some passive stretches to do with your children, taking the limbs through range of movement so that you maintain and make sure that you keep an eye on the muscles' length and making sure that they're not getting any tightness, all right, in their joints. To be fair, there's very little evidence that they'll do anything for your child with regards to improving their movement, okay? They are there really as a way of us having a look to check that the movements haven't deteriorated, and for you to get warning signs and say, oi, excuse me, Helen, his ankle seems to be getting a bit tighter. I've checked him, you know, I've been checking him every day, and he looks like he's had a bit of a growth spurt and he feels a bit tighter. So really, the evidence shows that active movements out of the spastic pattern are much more effective at re-educating the brain and maintaining function. So it's really important that we do activities actively rather than you doing it for them. All right, they've got to do it themselves, and that's how those new lines of communication develop between the limb and the body. Okay, and what it's doing, the brain. Sorry, the limbs and the brain. So the therapist will work on functional movement patterns with the affected side to develop skills. So we start centrally, like we say, stabilise what's going on here, so that you can work peripherally and get good movement patterns and not abnormal movement patterns where the child's trying to do something in a spastic pattern. You want them to do it in a more normal pattern. So to aid the latter, the therapist may use equipment such as the ankle-foot orthosis, which we talked about earlier, for dropped foot, because that will just hold the foot up so that they can get a nice heel strike and transfer their weight, and they're not slapping the foot down as they walk and having to bend the knee more, okay, to clear the floor. Also, we've got hand splints, which enable the child to sort of work then on reaching and grasping. They're not having to think about trying to open their fingers if they've got a little splint on that is actually keeping their hand open for them, and it's a dynamic splint, so they've got some movement there. Then you can work on that reach and grasp, all right, and getting some activity there. So hand splint to enable the child to not have to think about everything whilst they're learning a new skill. We break skills right down to the bare minimum, and you'll probably have it in your HemiHelp group with your tying laces, you know, breaking it right the way down to all the different stages, and that's what a physio should do with movement patterns. Okay? So an AFO can double up as an aid to compensate for leg length discrepancy as well, which again Anne touched on when she was saying about the growth of the hemiplegic side can be more limited. And so often the children will have a leg length discrepancy. Some of the time it doesn't affect their posture, they're not asymmetrical with it, they adapt and they're fine, but other times it does. And if we use an AFO, it gives us an extra centimetre, so that can often just be enough to get them back into alignment, so the asymmetry is minimised. Strengthening muscles in positions out again, out of the spastic pattern all the time. It's out of the spastic pattern. It's used to a limited degree with younger children, obviously because they don't really understand what you're trying to do. So you can do it through play, through activities, but you're not going to do specific strength training, which is more done when the children get a little bit older, when they get to 8 or 9 and they can understand a little bit more, and you can do some work with working on developing the muscle strength out of the spastic pattern, because underlying the spastic muscles are weak. Bilateral activities are encouraged in children with hemiplegia as it makes them use both their arms and their legs. And what I mean by bilateral activities is not things that we get them to do something with 2 hands. We get them to do activities where they have to use 2 hands. Swimming, you're going to sink if you don't use both arms and both legs. Do you know what I mean? So it's those kind of things. Eating, you can do unilaterally, but most people do it with 2 hands socially. That's what it looks best, sort of thing. So we would go for activities generally that you can't do easily with one side of your body. So things like riding a bike, things like swimming, dressing, eating, baking, things where you need 2 hands. Okay? So bilateral activities are really important, and also bilateral responses, because they're imperative for protecting yourself. When you go, how many kids with hemiplegia fall on the floor and bang their heads because they put one arm down and the other one gives way? So it's really important that we do saving responses, and the safest way to do that is get them in soft play areas and get them running around and falling over where they're not going to get hurt, and they're starting to learn those sorts of things. And we would be doing a lot of work on sort of the therapy balls and stuff like that to get them getting those arms out to protect themselves. The other options to treatment available to therapists are really, they're specialist centres that would provide these treatments. They're not standard in your bog standard sort of NHS hospital like I work in. You would refer them on to a specialist centre. So for us, botulinum toxin injections would be done at Leeds, and we would refer our kids into Leeds. So these sorts of things are extra too that we can get for your child. Well, we can. I'm not saying wherever you are. We can get for your child, but they're not usually your bog standard that your hospital does them. So we have botulinum toxin injections, which Anne's touched on. We've got lycra garments, which are quite popular. I have mixed opinions. Sometimes they work fantastically. Sometimes they do very little. I find they work better on hands than they do on legs. And I did have a 3-year-old little girl once who they put a lycra splint on her hand, the orthotist, and she turned to him and she said, she turned to her mummy and she said, "Mummy, that man's given me a hand." And I was just floored, because it just makes you realise the input they're getting from having something on like that. Now, I'm not saying that works all the time. This was just a one-off thing, but she was a 3-year-old little girl, and that's what she said to her mummy with no prompting at all. So they do have their place. Functional electrical stimulation, or you might have heard of it as FNS, functional neuromuscular stimulation, which is for older children really. Little ones can't really tolerate it. It's a bit like when you were pregnant, when you have TNS and you get that sort of funny sensation. But what it does is it makes the muscles contract, so that if you've got, for example, a dropped foot, you'd put the electrodes on the calf and it would make the foot go like this. Now, they're really good for older children, and they're really good for working on the child doing it actively with the therapist or with the parents. No good just sitting there going with the machine, because it's not going to do anything. That's not going to feed back into the brain, all right? The child's got to actively be doing it with the machine. So all these things are sort of available, but not necessary, depending on your child's age and depending on their toleration of things like this. Surgery is obviously an option, and as Anne touched on, we don't go down that route unless it's necessary. We don't do repetitive surgery, at 4, and then again they're having to do it at 11, and then again at 16, because it just creates scar tissue and it decreases functional ability. So we would really only use it when it's absolutely necessary. Usually we leave it to the children get towards sort of teenagers if it's necessary then. And more common now is things like tendon transplants, tendon transfers, so moving where you've got a flexor tendon, which a flexion is where you bend, an extension is where you take your hand up, they'll move a tendon from here to here to get it to work the opposite way. So that is happening, you know, in some places. That's an option, but it's quite. It needs a lot of work afterwards, because again, it's that active work that you need to do. It's not going to work if the child just sits there and doesn't do anything with their arm after the surgery. All right. Some therapists advocate constraint therapy. You might have heard that, constraint-induced therapy, which is where you obviously don't let the affected limb. You don't let them use their unaffected limb, and you get them to use their affected limb. So that's back in vogue, to be honest, at the moment. Constraint-induced or constraint therapy. Some therapists will use serial casting. I use that for stretching out the ankle, so the tender Achilles, when that gets tight, they start going up on their toes. We serial cast, get them back into a good position, and we'll often do that after Botox, like Anne says, because you get the relaxation of the muscle and you can get a much better position of the foot. Tactile stimulation, it's used a lot with occupational therapies, where they're doing the sort of touch, different textures, deep pressure, massage, all of those sorts of things, particularly on the upper limb. You know, a lot of therapists use that, particularly OTs, like I say, and it just heightens the awareness of that side. But if you're ever doing anything like that, always remember to do it up the limb, not down it, okay? Down it will encourage flexion, which is what you don't want. Up it will encourage extension. So if you're doing any kind of stroking or massage, do it up the limb. And you do it on the extensor part of the arm. So it's this part. Don't put your palm up to the ceiling. Do it on the other part. So that's the way you want to be doing it. Last bit. There's various orthotic devices that you can use, tone-inhibiting insoles, dynamic hand splints, arm leg gaiters. Some of you might have that. We use arm gaiters for weight bearing and leg gaiters for weight bearing, so the child doesn't have to worry about controlling their elbow or their knee. And occupational therapists obviously work on the perceptual side, which Anne touched on, with your visual perceptual difficulties with children, mainly with children who have right-sided damage, because that's where your area of perception is, so left hemiplegia, right-side damage.
Sorry, I read in the hemiplegia book that there was a comment that they didn't think they did anything.
Sorry?
Pedro boots.
Pedro boots.
In the hemiplegia book.